Hey guys, some of you said that it would be helpful if I read a couple of stories to you, and so I think tonight I am going to read Little Ida's Flowers from the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales. It's one of my absolute favorites, and I hope you guys like it. Anyway, this is Little Ida's Flowers. My poor flowers are quite dead, said Little Ida. They were so pretty last night, and now the petals are all withered. Why? She asked the student who sat on the sofa. She was really very fond of this student, and he could tell the loveliest of stories and cut out such amusing pictures, hearts with little ladies in them that danced, flowers, and big palaces with doors that you could open. He was a really jolly student. Why are the flowers looking so poorly today? She asked again, showing him a whole bunch that were quite withered. Shall I tell you what's wrong with them? Said the student. The flowers were at a ball last night, and that's why they are drooping. Oh, but flowers can't dance, said little Ida. Oh, yes, said the student. When it grows dark and we are all asleep, they skip around to their heart's delight. They have a ball nearly every night of the week. Are children ever allowed at their ball? Why, yes, said the student. Baby daisies and lilies of the valley. Where do the nicest flowers dance? Asked little Ida. You must often have been out at the gate of the big palace where the king lives in the summer, where there's a lovely garden full of flowers. Surely you've seen the swans that come swimming towards you when you go to feed them with the breadcrumbs? That's the place for a ball, all right. I was in the garden yesterday with my mother, said Ida, but all the trees were bare and there wasn't a flower left. Where are they? In the summer I saw so many. They're in the palace, said the student. You know, as soon as the king and all his courtiers move into town, the flowers run straight into the palace from the garden and have a gay time. You should just see them. The two most beautiful roses seat themselves on the throne and are king and queen. The scarlet coxcombs all line up alongside and stand and bow. They are the gentlemen in waiting. Then along come all the prettiest flowers, and there's a grand ball. The blue violets are little naval cadets, and dance with the hyacinths and crocuses, calling them young ladies. The tulips and the large yellow lilies are old ladies. They see to it that everyone dances nicely and that everything goes off properly. But, asked little Ida, does nobody ever say anything to the flowers for dancing in the king's palace? Nobody really knows anything about it, said the student. Sometimes, during the night, the old caretaker who has to look after the palace may come along, carrying his big bunch of keys. But the moment the flowers hear the keys jingle, they are perfectly still, hiding behind the curtains and poking their heads out. I can smell flowers in here, the old caretaker will say, but he can't see them. How jolly, cried little Ida, clapping her hands. And can't I see the flowers either? Why, yes, said the student. Next time you go there, just remember to look in at the window. Then you'll see them. I did today, and there lying full length on the sofa was a tall, yellow daffodil, pretending to be a lady in waiting. Can the flowers in the botanical gardens go there as well? Can they go all that long way? Why, of course, said the student. When they want to, they can fly. Surely you've seen those pretty butterflies, the red and yellow and white ones? They look almost like flowers, and in fact that's what they've been. Jumping off their stalks high into the air, they flapped their petals like little wings and flew away. Having got off to a good start, they were allowed to fly about all day too, without having to go home again and sit still on their stalks. And so, in the end, their petals turned into real wings. Well now, you've seen that yourself. But perhaps the flowers in the botanical gardens have never been to the king's palace, and don't know that it's so gay there at night. I'll tell you something that will surprise the old professor of botany that lives next door. You know him, I'm sure. When you go into the garden, tell one of the flowers that there's a grand ball taking place at the palace. It will pass on the news to all the others, and they'll fly off. Then, when the professor goes into the garden, there won't be a single flower there, and he won't be able to make out where they've all gone. But how can the flower tell the others? Flowers can't speak, can they? No, of course they can't, replied the student, but they can make signs. Surely you've seen, when a breeze is blowing, how the flowers nod and move all their green leaves just as plainly as though they were talking. Can the professor understand sign language? Asked Ida. Yes, to be sure he can. Going into his garden one morning, he saw a big stinging nettle making signs with its leaves to a lovely red carnation. It was saying, "You are so pretty, and I love you so very much." Well, now the professor doesn't like that sort of thing, and he at once rapped it over the leaves. Those are the nettle's knuckles. But of course he got stung, and from that day he never dared to touch a stinging nettle. What fun, cried little Ida, laughing. What nonsense is this to stuff into a child's head, said the tiresome old counselor, who was on a visit and was sitting on the sofa. He didn't like the student and always used to grumble when he saw him cutting those comical pictures. Now a man hanging from a gibbet and holding a heart in his hand, because he was a stealer of hearts, and now an old witch riding a broomstick and carrying her husband on her nose. The counselor didn't like it, and so he would say, as he said now, "What nonsense is this to stuff into a child's head? What a lot of silly nonsense." But little Ida thought that what the student told her about her flowers was great fun, and she kept on thinking about it. The flowers were drooping because they were tired after dancing all night. They were certainly ill. And so she took them to where all her other playthings were, standing on a nice little table, the drawer of which was full of many things. Lying asleep in her cot was her doll, Sophie. But little Ida said to her, "You'll really have to get up, Sophie, and make do with the bed in the drawer tonight. The poor flowers are ill, and will have to lie in your bed. Perhaps then they'll get well." And with that she picked the doll up, only it looked so grumpy and never said a word, because it was annoyed at having to leave its bed. Then, putting the flowers in the cot, and drawing the little blanket right over them, Ida told them to be nice and quiet, and then she would make them some tea, so that they might get better and be up the next day, and she drew the curtains close around the little cot, so the sun wouldn't shine in their eyes. All the evening, she couldn't take her mind off what the student had told her, and when her own bedtime came around, she first had to go behind the curtains which hung in front of the windows where her mother's lovely flowers stood, the hyacinths and tulips. And there, very softly, she whispered, "I know that you're going to a ball tonight." The flowers behaved as though they didn't understand a thing and never stirred a petal, but little Ida knew differently. She got into bed and lay there a long while, thinking how nice it would be to see the lovely flowers dance, out there at the king's palace. "I wonder if my flowers really have been there," she thought, but then she fell asleep. Late at night she woke up again. She had dreamt about the flowers, and about the student whom the counselor had scolded and said was stuffing her head with nonsense. In the bedroom where Ida lay, it was perfectly still. The nightlight was burning on the table, and her father and mother were asleep. "Now I wonder if my flowers are in Sophie's bed," she said to herself. "How I'd just love to know." Sitting up in bed, she looked towards the door, which was half open. Through there lay all her flowers and toys. She listened, and then all at once she seemed to hear a piano being played in the room, but very softly and more beautifully than she had ever heard before. "I dare say all the flowers are in there dancing now," she said. "I say, but I would love to see it," only she didn't dare to get up, or she would have woken her father and mother. "If only they would come in here," she said. But the flowers never came, and the music went on playing so beautifully that she just couldn't help herself. It was too lovely for words. Creeping out of her little bed, she went ever so softly to the door and peeped into the sitting room, and then, my word, what a jolly sight she saw! There wasn't a nightlight in there, and yet it was perfectly light. The moon shone through the window onto the middle of the floor. It might almost have been broad daylight. The tulips and hyacinths all stood in 2 long rows on the floor. There were no more in the window, only empty pots. Down on the floor, the flowers were all dancing very prettily around one another, forming a grand chain and holding one another by their long green leaves as they swung around. Sitting at the piano was a big yellow lily, which little Ida was certain she had seen that summer, for she distinctly remembered the students saying, "Goodness, isn't it just like Miss Lena?" And then they had all laughed at him, but now Ida really did think that the yellow flower was like the young lady, and it was behaving in exactly the same way while playing, now laying its oblong yellow face to one side and now to the other, and nodding in time to the lovely music. Nobody took any notice of little Ida, and then all at once she saw a big blue crocus jump right onto the table where the toys were, and going straight to the doll's bed, pull aside the curtains. There lay the sick flowers, but they at once got up and nodded to the rest to say they too wanted to join the dance. An old pipe smoker, whose bottom lip was broken, stood up and bowed to the pretty flowers. They didn't look a bit ill, but jumped down among the others and were ever so delighted. All at once there was a sound of something falling off the table, and on looking across Ida saw that her streamer had jumped down. It seemed to think itself one of the flowers. It was a very pretty one, too, and at the top there was a little wax doll, wearing exactly the same sort of broad-trimmed hat as the counselor. hopping on its 3 red wooden legs and among the flowers. The streamer stamped about rather heavily, dancing a mazurka. This was a dance which the flowers couldn't do because they were so very light and weren't able to stamp. And then all at once the wax doll grew big and long, and whirling around above the paper ribbons, it cried out in a loud voice, "What nonsense is this to stuff into the child's head? What a lot of silly rubbish!" And at that moment it was the very image of the counselor in the broad-brimmed hat, and looked just as gray and grumpy. But the paper ribbons beat him about his lanky legs, and he shrank and became a tiny little wax doll again. This was such fun to see. Little Ida couldn't help but laugh. The streamer kept on dancing, and the counselor had to dance with it. It wasn't a bit of use trying to make himself big and long, or turning himself into the yellow doll with the big black hat. But then the flowers pleaded for him, especially the ones which had lain in the doll's bed, and so the streamer stopped. Just then there was a rather loud knock from inside the door, where Ida's doll, Sophie, lay together with all the other toys. Running to the edge of the table, and lying full length on his stomach, the pipe smoker managed to pull the door open a little, and then Sophie got up and looked around full of surprise. "A ball, I see," she said, "and why was I never told?" "Will you dance with me?" asked the pipe smoker. "You're a nice fellow to dance, aren't you?" she said, turning her back on him. And with that she sat down on the drawer, thinking that one of the flowers would surely come and engage her, but none of them did, and so she coughed, and still nobody came. The pipe smoker then danced all by himself, and that wasn't so bad. Now, as none of the flowers seemed to notice her, Sophie dropped from the door straight onto the floor, causing quite a stir. All the flowers came crowding around her, asking her if she had hurt herself, and they were all so nice to her, especially the flowers which had lain in her cot, but she hadn't hurt herself a bit, and all Ida's flowers thanked her for the lovely bed, and made such a fuss of her, taking her into the middle of the room where it was moonlight and dancing with her. And all the other flowers formed a circle around them. Now Sophie was delighted, and she told them they might keep her bed. She didn't mind sleeping in the drawer at all, she said, but the flowers said, "Thank you very much, but we can't live for very long. Tomorrow we shall be quite dead. Only tell little Ida to bury us in the garden where the canary lies, and then we'll grow up again next summer and be prettier than ever." "Oh, but you mustn't die," said Sophie, as she kissed the flowers. At that very moment the door opened, and a whole crowd of lovely flowers came dancing into the room. Ida couldn't make out where they had all come from. They must surely have been the flowers from the king's palace. Leading the way were 2 lovely roses, wearing little gold crowns. They were a king and a queen. Then came the prettiest of stalks in pinks, bowing all around them. They brought music with them. Big poppies and peonies were blowing pea pods till they made themselves red in the face. Bluebells and little white snowdrops were tinkling as if they had real bells on. It was the gayest of music. And then came many other flowers, all of them dancing, blue violets and red daisies, mayweeds and lilies of the valley, and all the flowers kissed one another in a way that was delightful to see. At last the flowers wished each other good night, and then little Ida too crept back to bed, where she dreamt of all that she had seen. When she got up next morning, she went straight over to the little table to see if the flowers were still there. She drew aside the curtain from the little bed, and, why yes, there they all lay. Only they were quite withered, much more than the day before. Sophie lay in the drawer where she had put her, and looked rather sleepy. "Can you remember what you had to tell me?" said little Ida. But Sophie looked utterly stupid and never said a word. "You're a really naughty girl," said Ida, "and yet they all danced with you." Then taking a small cardboard box on which were drawn some pretty little birds, she opened it and laid the dead flowers inside. "This shall be your pretty little coffins," she said, "and when my Norwegian cousins arrive, they shall help me to bury you in the garden, so that next summer you will be able to grow up and be prettier than ever." Her Norwegian cousins were 2 smart boys called Jonas and Adolf. Their father had given them new bows and arrows, and they had brought them to show Ida. She told them about the poor flowers that were dead, and then they were allowed to bury them. The 2 boys walked in front, carrying their bows over their shoulders, and little Ida followed with the dead flowers in the pretty box. In the garden they dug a small grave. Kissing the flowers first, Ida laid them in the ground with the box, and Adolf and Jonas shot their arrows over the grave, having neither shotguns nor cannon to fire. Okay guys, that was Little Ida's Flowers. Thanks so much for listening and I hope you liked it.